Hi, it's Miles here at Fabricana. Today we've got a really exciting video on how to make... Excuse me, I just have to take this call. Hello, sewing hotline, Miles speaking. A sewing emergency? A cape? And you need it when? I'll be right there. Sounds like this is a job for the sewist. Hi, it's Miles here. In case you don't recognize me with my glasses on, we are having a bit of fun today. A little bit of drama, just that kind of thing of a great disguise that a pair of glasses can make. Anyway, on to the sewing for today. We're going to be making this awesome superhero cape. It is kind of a beginner project. We're going to show you how to make the pattern. I really love that it's fully lined and it has this nice kind of facing where the satin comes in. I'm going to show you how to do the extra wide double fold bias tape tie. It's really fun. I hope you enjoy making it. We're making it. We wanted to make it for a while because our original superhero cape video, the sound wasn't great, so I know a lot of people are having trouble hearing me. So we've got a much better sound system. So hopefully you'll hear every word and you'll be able to follow along. If you want to see all the rest of our content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure your notifications are turned on. We also have great content that comes to you through our Facebook and Instagram pages as well, so follow us there as well. And enjoy the cape! Let's talk about what we need for this cape. So first of all, of course, we've chosen this beautiful rich red. It's actually a crepe back satin, a beautiful polyester fabric with really nice drape to it. I've also got this beautiful lining fabric. Like we said, this is going to be a lined cape, so we did need some lining fabric. Now, to figure out how much fabric you need, if you look at the length of cape that you're looking for, if you essentially double that, plus a little bit extra for the allowance for the neck, that will give you an idea of how much fabric you need. I've got some double fold, extra wide double fold bias tape. So it's basically a tape that's folded in four, and that is going to be our neck edge and our tie. So I've purchased about a yard, about a meter would be enough for an adult cape. Disclaimer, if you're making something for a child, please don't use a tie to secure it. You can use the same kind of tape, but better to apply snaps or Velcro, something that would be released if there's pressure on it. We don't want to have things tied around a child's neck. Of course, we need some scissors, or if you are safe with a rotary cutter, have some experience, I'm going to be using a rotary cutter and a ruler. You'll need a ruler anyway, so make sure to have one handy. I also have a fabric marker. I'm using just a nice chalk pencil. And I need some pins. Of course, we'll need our sewing machine with the coordinating thread. Yeah, I think that's about it. We're ready to get started making the pattern. As many of you know from watching other videos, I am a planner. I would usually make a paper pattern, but because this pattern is very simple, we're going to be making it directly onto the fabric. The first thing that I need to do is remove the salvage from one of the edges of the fabric. So in order to remove the one salvage, I've folded my fabric in half so I can do 2 layers at a time. If you're using scissors, you can just use your ruler and chalk to mark a line. I'm going to be using the rotary cutter, so I'm just going to line up the cutter and I'm just going to remove about 3/4 of an inch from the edge, and that will remove all of the salvage. If you're not comfortable with a rotary cutter, please don't try it for the first time making this cape. And we have removed the salvage, have a nice straight edge. So that once we've removed our salvage, I have my fabric folded in half. I have it nice and straight here. We need to mark along that cut edge our facing width. And that is going to be 1.5 inches. So you can line up your ruler on that cut edge where you remove the salvages. And we're going to mark that with our fabric marker all the way along that edge, 1.5 inches. So what that 1.5 represents is a 1-inch facing and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So once we have our facing line drawn, I'm going to take some pins. I'm going to pin through the 2 layers of fabric all the way down that facing. That's just to make sure that the fabric doesn't move. This fabric is fairly slippery. So I'm going to pin it in place to make sure it doesn't move while we're cutting out our cape. So once we have our facings pinned, we're ready to start marking our neck edge. For this adult size cape, I'm using a radius of about 4.5 inches. It's about 11.5 centimeters. So what I need to do is find the point where my drawn line meets the fold, and I'm going to put the end of my tape at that point, and I'm going to find where 4.5 meets on the fold. I'm going to draw a mark there, and I'm going to pivot, keeping the end of my tape at that point, and mark 4.5 inches again, and I'm going to continue that process until I have a quarter of a circle. So once we have our neck edge marked, I'm going to put in a few pins to keep it from slipping while we mark the hem. Now I'm putting the pins kind of at like a ray from that center point, because I'm really folding the fabric back and I don't want the pins to get in the way. So once we have the pins in the facing and now the pins in the neck, I'm going to turn the whole work so that we can mark the hem. So I'm going to do the exact same process. This time I'm first going to mark the finished length of my cape. So I'm actually marking from the neck edge that we just marked, and my cape is going to be about 36 inches long from the neck edge. So I'm going to measure from the neck edge 36 inches, and I'm going to put a mark right at that fold. So once we have our length marked, we're actually going to move the edge of our tape back to that point where we did the circle for the neck edge. So we're going to start the tape measure at that point. So I'm actually now, the length looks like it's about 40.5 inches. It's 36 from the neck edge, but it's 40.5 from that center point of our circle. And I'm marking all the way along this edge, 40.5 inches, so that's 4.5 inches plus 36. My length is 40.5. So if you want a longer cape, you can always do the math. Circumference equals pi times diameter. See, all these things we learned in school come into play later. So you can see this quarter circle that's occurring. I'm going to continue that all the way to that facing edge. So once we have our hem marked, that quarter circle, we're just going to place a few pins near the hem to keep the fabric from slipping as we cut. Once you've got those pins in place, we can start cutting. So once we have our pins in place, making sure our fabric doesn't slip, we're ready to start cutting. So I'm going to cut right on that chalk line, basically connecting the dots. This doesn't need to be perfect. It's meant to be a quick project. And I'll just continue all the way to the facing edge. Once we've cut our hem, we're ready to cut our neck edge. Exactly the same way we cut the hem. We're cutting right in our chalk line. And we're just going to continue right through the facing along the chalk line. So we've cut out our cape. I've laid out my lining. I've folded it exactly the same way I did the lining. I have my selvage here. There's no need to remove the selvage. We've got our nice long fold here. So I'm just going to lay that nice and flat. I'm going to grab my cape. Be very careful because there are pins. I'm going to line up my folded edges. And we're basically going to be doubling the cape with the lining. So I want to make sure that my straight edge is lined up nicely, just a little bit away from the selvage to give me some cutting allowance, and pin through all 4 layers to hold the cape in place while we're cutting the lining. So I'm going to continue to apply those pins, and then I'll show you how to cut. So we have our cape and our lining pieces on top of each other, still pinned. I'm going to remove the pins along the facing because we need to trim a little bit off the lining. So I'm just going to fold back the main fabric, leaving the 2 layers of lining. And we're going to remove 2 inches across the lining. So I'm going to grab my ruler, going to find my 2-inch line, and you could mark it with chalk, or you can just rotary cut it with the ruler as a guide. And there we've removed a 2-inch strip from our lining. Now the reason we're doing this is because we want the lining fully encased inside the cape so that we have a little bit of the facing of the main fabric showing on the inside of the cape. So once we've removed that 2-inch strip from the front edge of our cape on the lining, we are ready to start pinning the lining and the cape together. So we're going to be using the nice shiny side of the satin. So I'm going to place that right side up. I'm going to take my lining and I'm going to place that right side down. And we're just going to pin the lining to the cape along those straight edges where the facing is, the front opening of our cape. Just going to line them up nicely. I'm going to apply pins to that long length, and then we're going to bring that to the sewing machine. We'll be doing that for both sides, left and right. So we're starting at the top neck edge. We've got our lining and our main cape fabric pinned together, right sides together, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to start sewing with the back stitch. We're going to remove our pins as we go. We're going to end with a nice secure back stitch. So we have both long edges stitched now. There we go. You'll notice if you try and lay the neck edge flat, of course the neck edge is longer on the actual main cape fabric and the lining is shorter. So you'll see that to get it to lay flat, we actually have to fold back the facing. I'm hoping that's making sense. It'll make a little bit more sense after we're pressed. So I'm going to open up those long seams. We're actually going to press the seam allowances toward the lining. Just be very careful with the temperature of your iron. If you're working with a polyester like I am, we're just pressing those seam allowances toward the lining. We're pressing from the face as well, just to make sure that those seams are fully open, because now we can see them. And we're going to repeat this process on the other side. Now that pressing should hold, but I'm also going to put in an edge stitching just to make sure that those seam allowances are always going toward the lining. So we're going to go over to the machine and we will do that. So as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that our seam stays toward the lining. So I'm just going to do an edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch over from my seam. Once that's done, we're going to be ready to do the hem, but I'll just quickly do this edge stitch. So we have our lining stitched to the cape. We have pressed our seam allowances toward the lining and edge stitched them in place. Now we are ready to start pinning and stitching the hem, the lining and the cape together. So as you recall, we have a marking for our facing. So at that point, we're going to fold the facing back. So right sides together, those 2 shiny sides of the satin are facing each other, folded at that line. I'm going to put a pin in there. I'm going to repeat at the other side, put another pin in. So once those facings are in place, we're just going to lay our lining flat on the cape fabric, and we're going to continue pinning that big half circle. So we've pinned all along our hem through the lining and our main cape fabric. We're going to sew the hem with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch. So we have our nice long hem stitch, that long curved edge. We're ready to turn our cape right side out, but firstly, I just want to trim the corners, just like that. So once I have the cape turned right sides out, I'm ready to press it. So we have pressed our hem, looking nice and crisp. Now we need to press the front edge. So remember, we have a facing. So we just want to make sure that that 1 inch facing that we have is showing, because that is wraps around to the inside of the garment. So you can just kind of eyeball it or use a ruler. I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to do this on the other side as well. And then we'll be ready to start working on the neck edge and applying the bias binding. So we have our cape hem edge pressed. We have our front facings pressed. You can see that nice bit of satin showing to the inside of the cape. We are ready to start applying our extra wide double fold bias tape to our cape. So you notice I have my lining side face up. I'm going to open out my double fold bias tape, one of the edges to that raw edge. I'm going to find my center point, or close to my center point, and I'm going to match that point to the center neck edge. And I'm going to apply with a pin that raw edge up against the raw edge of the neck edge. So once I've pinned that center, I'm going to wrap the bias around that curved edge of the neckline and apply more pins. And once I've got the whole bias pinned in place, I can bring it to the sewing machine. So when we're stitching on double fold bias tape, we want to stitch right in that first crease close to that raw edge. So I'm going to line up my needle with that crease, starting right at that front facing edge. Do a back stitch, and I'm going to continue sewing all along that neck edge. So we have stitched that bias tape to our neck edge, so we're actually going to turn our work over to the right side, so that nice shiny satin side, and then basically we're going to wrap the bias around to the outside. So it's already pre-pressed, so it kind of wants to do that anyway. So we're going to go right to the end of the tie. And I'm not worried about this raw edge, it's on the bias, so it's not going to unravel. And I'm going to stitch very close to that folded edge. So kind of where the bias opens, we're basically stitching that closed. So what the bias does is it encases all of those raw edges from the neck edge inside the bias tape, and it also provides a way to tie the cape. And here we have our finished cape. There's something about wearing a cape that definitely brings out my inner child. I really enjoyed making this project. I hope you enjoyed following along. I hope to have an opportunity to wear this, maybe for Halloween or a costume party coming up soon. If you're interested in making, I hope you're subscribed to our YouTube channel and have your notifications turned on so you don't miss a video. And we also have lots of great DIY content on our Facebook page and our Instagram, so follow us there for all of the best content, and we shall see you soon.